All right. Take off my glasses of the light. Good afternoon, everyone. I think that there are people in this room. Good afternoon. I am excited to facilitate this panel that we are going to engage in, and I'm hopeful that you all came in because the title of the panel was enticing. My name is Nicole Turner-Lee. I'm a senior fellow and the director of the Center for Technology Innovation at the Brookings Institution. I'm a sociologist with some military expertise on the level of AI, just because my research really demands this interrogation of these emerging technologies in ways in which they do not discourage or foreclose on opportunities for more marginalized populations. But I've had the opportunity over the last couple of years to sit at West Point at many of the military academies and talk about autonomous weaponry and what that means for our society. So this particular panel is of interest because of two reasons. One, it's no secret that AI and autonomous weapons has really become a point of fact. If you just look at what has occurred in the Ukrainian war, or if you look at what has been going on in the Israel-Gaza conflict, there's been a lot of deployment of autonomous weaponry. And part of the conversation that we're gonna have today is not only like, what does that look like technically, but what are the implications outside of the military operation of those particular weapons? And I think that's a particularly interesting conversation to have, and it ties back to some of my work when we start to think about the engagement of civilians and the compliance with international law, particularly humanitarian law. So in the spirit of this conference, we hope to dig into some or many of those issues just by fact of the very talented people we have with us today. So I'm gonna ask that we listen to our panelists at least for the next 45 minutes, and we will do Q&A. So if you have questions out there, just put them on a note card and hold on to them. We'll have about 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A. And because I've done that, somebody better have questions so that I can make sure we use that time wisely. I've asked our panelists to start with some opening remarks, so I'll just do a brief introduction. In a moment, you're gonna see our dear panelist who is sitting there in Japan, and I'll introduce her in just a moment. Technology, right? But we are in the company of Lauren Voss, who is an attorney and senior policy advisor who specializes in the rule of law, national security, and foreign policy. She's at the Pentagon doing joint targeting. We have Sherry Krebs, who's at Deakin University, a law professor there and the director of the Center for Law as Protection, and she also serves as the chair of the ACEL Liber Society on the Law of Armed Conflict and is an affiliate scholar to Stanford University Center. And Michael Sullmeyer, who's at Georgetown University. He is in the School of Foreign Service as a professor and director of cyber programs this fall, and prior to that, he served as Assistant Secretary of Defense for Cyber Policy and Principal Cyber Advisor to the Secretary of Defense. So let's give them all a round of applause before we get started. And let's turn it over to you, Lauren, just to give us some background. That way people can understand the work that you're doing and set the stage for the conversation that we're gonna have. So we're gonna start out with some opening remarks, and then I have a few questions, and then again, we'll move into Q&A. So I'll be seated.
All right, thank you. One caveat before I begin is you always hear from people in government, I'm giving these remarks in my personal capacity, and they do not represent the United States Air Force or the US government. Of course, since we're talking about AI, the first thing I did was ask ChatGPT what I should talk about today. It was actually not bad. It would have taken about an hour to cover everything that it said, so we're not gonna do that today. But it just shows you how far it's come. So today I want to instead focus on the framework that I apply to thinking about these topics and explain what I think its value is. So we're gonna go a little bit outside of law to start. We're gonna start with Clausewitz. Has anyone read Clausewitz before? You can raise your hand. Okay, like 3 people, 4 or 5. Probably those that raise their hands are people that have served in uniform because you're forced to read it. He wrote a seminal treaty on military strategy called On War, not creative, but you know what it's about. And one of the concepts in it is the nature of warfare versus the character of warfare, right? So nature is the basic makeup of a thing. It's what it is at its core, what makes that thing its thing, right? And then you have the idea that war, according to Clausewitz, it's chaotic, inherently political, and violent. So those are the 3 characteristics that we talk about. Character, on the other hand, that's the technology, the tools, and in warfare, that's the weapons. They can change over time, how you might use them, what your strategy might be, but the nature of warfare is unchanging, or so the argument goes. The character will change with your weaponry, with your tools, with your strategy. And this unchanging nature of war is why a set legal framework could be developed, right, and apply across types of conflict, geographic regions, and then over time, because this underlying nature of warfare stayed the same, and so you could put rules on it, right? And so that's the law of armed conflict, law of war, international humanitarian law, whatever you may call it. I'll call it LOAC for today. And some of you are likely very familiar with some of its core concepts, right? And so just quickly, distinction being one of them, is the requirement that you have to distinguish between civilians and combatants and between civilian objects and military objectives, right? Like that's a basic concept here. In practice, though, that requires you need to identify the combatants, but you also need to be able to identify civilians, military objectives, and civilian objects. So you're not just identifying the military piece, you actually need to be able to identify the civilian piece as well. And in order to accurately identify these things, you have intelligence analysts that collect, analyze, and provide intelligence information that enables decision makers to determine whether they're reasonably confident that a proposed target is indeed a valid military objective, right? So you have layers underneath this. One more Clausewitz concept, and then I'll stop on the Clausewitz side, but it's the idea of the fog of war, right? So he didn't use that exact term, but it's the same concept. He said, quote, "War is the realm of uncertainty. 3/4 of the factors on which action in war is based are wrapped in a fog of greater or lesser uncertainty." So fog of war is the fact that decisions in warfare are made without perfect information and frequently with inaccurate information or assumptions. And that's just a concept that unfortunately is reality today. So for those core principles in IHL, like distinction, what's the legal standard in which one must act? For our purposes today, I'm gonna call it a reasonable level of certainty. It's incredibly more nuanced than that. Some people say reasonable, some people say honest, some people mix those, some people say it depends on the decision level. In the US DoD Law of War Manual, we use a good faith standard, which sounds subjective, but when you read the definition, it actually has objective pieces to it too. So it's requiring the exercise of professional judgment and determining what is reasonable. So if we build on that framework by applying those legal standards to AI, and I think it's important to distinguish between AI and other emerging tech, right? So when we talk about things like drone swarms, it's not clear that these are something new and different, or they're just a change to the character of warfare, right? It's new weapons that are introduced. Yes, you can, they now have standoff capabilities, but we already introduced drones, we had ballistic missiles, we had standoff munitions, right? And so it's just, to me, another step of development. AI, on the other hand, is a different way of thinking, right? And so what are we seeing AI do today? I'll caveat all of these are open source, publicly available examples. The Center for New American Security talked about the Ukrainian military using AI to look through large amounts of open source data and geolocate social media content, identifying Russian soldiers, weapons, systems, units, and be able to track them and line those up as targets, right? And it's not really clear what role humans were playing in verifying that these were indeed military objectives, but there was an identification piece going on by AI. The IDF created a large language model to understand large amounts of surveillance data. We've also had, the IDF, the former chief of the IDF said back in 2023 that with AI, they could create up to 100 targets a day. IDF is also described using AI to assist offensive decision-making, actually determining if a target is a military objective or a civilian object. The Washington Post then raised the issue of, whether there's sufficient scrutiny of these recommendations, which raises the question of, well, what is sufficient scrutiny, right? My personal favorite was last year, the Palantir CEO claimed that Palantir software uses AI to analyze satellite imagery, open source data, drone footage, and reports from the ground, and then presents to commanders with military options. And he claimed that it is, quote, responsible for most of the targeting in Ukraine, end quote. So when we think through those examples, I would categorize them into three different categories. One, you have AI is gathering information that goes to an intelligence analyst. It's just pulling in massive amounts of information. The second is actually conducting analysis to support, decision making in some way, or making a recommendation towards identification or other decisions. And then third is potentially even AI acting as a decision maker. The second one might sound kind of scary still, that they're making recommendations, doing analysis, but AI is basically becoming your intelligence analyst, right? So I'd argue the legal framework is the same. A human decision maker will make a reasonable or not reasonable decision to rely on that analysis, whether it be human cognition-based analysis or AI-based. If your AI is transparent and audible, that leads credence to that being a reasonable decision. But the buck still stops at that decision maker, that human decision maker, as it does for all intelligence that they rely on, no matter where it comes from. The third category, though, is the one that's the most interesting question and the one that we tend to have people debate, right? What about AI that is the decision maker, the non-human cognition that's deciding who lives or dies, right? And I'm not going to advocate and say it's definitively a good thing to give this power to AI, but I don't see it as a complete ceding of the decision space. Even if in a tactical decision, AI might make the decision, at the strategic level, you will always have a human leader who's making a decision to employ AI in that way. And so that person or that group of people, will be the one that is responsible in all categories. And so we say that that level, per LOAC and for the United States per the DoD Law of War Manual falls on that human being. And I know that can be a contentious topic. So, an example that you could use that's outside of warfare that people are probably more familiar with is attorneys using ChatGPT to write their briefs. Gets in the news a lot, right? And they're getting caught by the courts by referencing cases that don't exist. So say someone used AI to write their brief and file it, right? Then the court determines there are made-up references within this brief. Who's to blame? It's the attorney, right? It is the attorney that decided to use AI in that way. So I want to circle us back to the original Clausewitz discussion, though. Is this usage of AI in any of those categories so different that it changes the nature of warfare? And if it does so, then does that require a relooking of LOAC, right? And so if the nature of war is chaotic, inherently political, and violent, right, I think that we could say the violence remains in this situation, even if it is AI. The inherently political, though, is driving why this fight is happening, and I think that remains too, but you have arguments out there that, it will remove the chaos, right? It will reduce this fog of war. And there's situations where it will to some extent, but it will not fully be removed, because I think that argument's overlooking 2 points. One is that AI-enabled technologies will maybe be able to gather and even assess unimaginable amounts of data, right? But these technologies are still vulnerable to the same age-old practices: denial, deception, camouflage, right? Like, not all of that information is going to be accurate. Secondly, AI can bring this information together, but that information has to exist, right? It still has to be collected, and it's always a limitation of the intelligence field. Some information is protected to such a level that we'll just never be able to access it, right? And in other cases, we don't have enough sensors to collect it. We will simply not have all of the information. Even if we have AI that would have the capacity to analyze it, we just don't have it. So the fog of war will remain. So, I think this means that LOAC is fit for purpose here. But the really interesting question will be how we restrict and interact with AI in order to ensure our decision makers are meeting the reasonable decision standard, right? And so I think that is where the question is and where we are and where I am focused. I think there are a number of recommendations out there. The 4 I'll leave you guys with today that I think are generally, everyone agrees on. One is that the methodologies of AI all need to be transparent and audible, right? You need to be able to look at what happened here and be able to see how they make decisions. 2, safeguards, protections such as disengagement or deactivation capabilities integrated into AI, right? Especially lethal AI. Third, the comprehensive legal reviews of new weapon systems that involve AI. But with self-learning or constantly updating AI, you also have to have a monitoring process, right, as that changes. And that's complicated, not something we've always thought for before. And then fourth, and to me the most important, is the education and understanding by decision makers, intel analysts, other relevant people on how AI works and how you can understand it. Because if we don't have that, I don't think it's possible for them to be able to be making those reasonable decisions. Thanks.
No, thank you. And I've got copious notes, and I will be able to come back to those when we get to Q&A. Let's go. Should we go online? Let's do our Shiri, who is in Japan. How about we have you jump in, and then we'll go over to Michael. Thank you. Plus, it guarantees that you're part of the conversation. Still can't. Yes, we got you. I think. Say something again. All right, we'll come back, right? We'll come on back. So, Michael, we'll go over to you. Oh, are you there, Shiri?
Sorry,
Yes, we can hear
the sound in the room is keep disconnecting, so I'm just not sure
We can hear
exactly
you.
what's happening in the room.
We can hear you.
Okay,
Okay.
great. Good. Okay, so just I missed some of the beginning of the panel, but hopefully I will not repeat things that were said already. So very glad to be joining you tonight. I wish I could be there in person, but I feel very grateful to be able to join you virtually from Akita in northern Japan. It's 3 a.m. now here. So I find it a bit difficult to talk about military technologies or AI in warfare at a day where, I think tents in El Bomasi in Gaza are still burning, and where we see every day and every hour the results of intense use of AI in advanced military technologies in warfare. So I thought I'll devote my opening remarks, which I'll keep very brief, to two ways in which I think AI in warfare makes challenges how we make decisions in war and what it means for legal compliance or the application of IHL.
We've lost.
Degree of humanism.
Keep going.
Yeah,
We
good?
may lose her feed. If we all can be respectful, we may lose her feed here and there, but I think we'll capture the gist of it. Keep talking.
Is there a connection problem?
Yeah, we can hear you though now, so just keep talking and we'll tell you if there's a long period of time that we can't.
Apologies, it's something in the room, not my connection. So I was just saying that it's difficult. No, you lost me again?
We can hear you.
Okay. So it was important for me to note that it is a difficult time to talk about military technologies as tents in Al-Mawasi in Gaza are burning. And as we see daily and hourly, the results of intense use of AI and advanced military technologies in warfare. So I wanted to highlight two particular elements in AI technologies that are, sorry, I'm just not sure if you can hear me. It keeps disconnecting from me. Anyways, the first one was speed, and the second one was mimicry of humanism. And while I agree with some of what I heard Lauren say before about the fact that uncertainty still exists, and I've written about Clausewitz fog of war concept in the past, so I completely agree that this is a problem that remains with or without AI. However, the speed of AI creates a situation where violence can intensify thousands times more. And it creates the opportunity and the urgency to respond to perceived and real threats. And that means that even if we have an algorithmic error rate that we think that is low, perhaps is low, the amount of actions that we can then pursue intensifies significantly, which means that the amount of errors will ultimately be large, even if the error rate itself is not. And so I think speed has several different issues with the changes in military violence. First, it creates a massive amounts of violence, and it enlarges significantly the scale of war and the threats to civilians in areas of armed conflict. But this speed also creates challenges when it comes to the human-machine interaction, because as we still keep humans in the loop cannot, our cognition as humans is just not at speed with the capabilities of military technologies. And so the ability of human decision makers to verify or to even analyze the information in front of them becomes much more challenging, especially as at the time where you have an urgent information coming that makes you feel that you have to respond immediately. That means, and sometimes you have one human that receives information from a swarm of drones, for example. And so the ability to look at that information, to understand some of the limitations of that information, to understand the capabilities of the technology is simply not there, definitely not at the speed that in which the technology can process information. I also wanted to say, and I think it relates to some of the things that Lauren mentioned before, that AI is not just the source of analysis of information in war. It is becoming much more difficult to separate between the source of the information and the analysis of the information. And in many of these cases, we have a variety of different advanced technologies that generate the information and the analysis at the very same time. And so it makes it much more difficult to look back and even have the capacity to falsify, in a scientific way, some of that information, the basic information and the analysis of the information. The second point that I wanted to make related to the mimicry of humanism that is ingrained in the way that we design drones and drone swarms and other types of technologies. We train those technologies based on human-based military practices, and those technologies are trained to try and mimic what humans would have done in similar situation, even though they're trained to be abilities. The problem is that with this immense capability and destruction, still comes also the limited cognitive abilities and some of the issues that we know from the area of before AI in war, right? So human decision making is always prone to cognitive limitations and cognitive biases, and those become ingrained in a systemic way or in a systematic way in these systems. And so we have a problem of more than human technologies that are still encompassing some of the limitations of the human that's designed them or the way that we collect and analyze information. And then we have less than humans, because as we rely on the technologies more and more, the capacities of human decision makers to function or to proceed with a variety of different cognitive processes is deteriorating as we use them less, as we rely on machines for that type of information. So I'll end, I think, my preliminary comments here, and I'm very happy to return to any of those during the Q&A, as well as to provide some examples from the recent warfare in Gaza.
Thank you so much. And we heard it. We heard you. So thank you. Michael, we'll go over to you, and then we'll ask a few questions before we go to audience Q&A.
Terrific. Good afternoon. Aisel, great to be with you today. My first time, long-time listener, first-time caller to be able to join, and it's great to be able to be here. I usually don't get to see my wife a whole lot during the day, but because my wife is a rock star international lawyer, I get to follow her around today. So she's here with me today, and I get to follow her around the Aisel curriculum. So very educational for me. While I was lucky enough to go to law school and follow Shiri around for a couple years, I've never actually practiced as a lawyer. I've been in the policy advising and later in the policy making role. And so my comments today will reflect more of that side than they would the international law or being a lawyer in government. Because of that, and because I left being the Assistant Secretary of Defense on January 20, I'm speaking only in my capacity as a stay-at-home dad until I join Georgetown University in the fall, which I'm really excited to get back in the classroom. Look, the opening note, just to say, putting the topic aside for just a second, I think when you look at this kind of topic, and there should be a series of questions we wonder about today, given the state of politics and partisanship. And I can just tell you that for me, I went through the Senate confirmation process last year, and by the end was able to get through via unanimous consent, and was one of the last ones to get through with bipartisan support. And it took work, but I got there. And I mention it because when so much seems to be subject to so much partisan disagreement, cyber operations and cybersecurity remains at least one area where the parties have been able to come together and agree on the right thing regardless of administration. And my hope going forward is that we can keep the politics out of computer network security. To be honest with you, it's kind of a boring topic anyway. And so, my hope is that we can keep focused on keeping the nation safe and let it start and stop with that. The argument I'd like to make for you today, though, is that despite the fact that, when you're in the cybersecurity business, you may not be the most popular person in the room. For me, I had no friends in 8th grade because I was building the middle school computer lab. But there's a lot to learn about the last 20 years of experience that we have with both the rise of the internet and as a government being involved in computer network operations to tell us a blueprint of how we might look at domestic and international legal issues going forward in the age of artificial intelligence. It's not a perfect one-to-one copy, but computer network security and cyber operations have a lot to tell us, especially about, I think, sovereignty, about frameworks like using international norms to manage state behavior, and also about the use of force, and a debate that's brewing right now about whether or not governments should authorize private actors to conduct offense in lieu of state action. So I'll talk about those, but what I would say for those who are new to the cyber operations, computer network operations, what am I talking about? What does that mean? That's not the help desk, right? That would be what we think of as IT. You're kind of run-of-the-mill IT. What I'm talking about is when nations and their proxies and their surrogates develop capabilities that can be used by their militaries to impose cost on other nations and other proxies. All right, so that's, again, not IT. This is about capability development for the imposition of costs in state-to-state conflict and state-to-state competition. And that actually has been around for a while. And the issue about autonomy is not new in that context, let alone in the context of AI. I'll give you an example. For those of you who read Black Hawk Down or saw the movie by Mark Bowden, he, in addition to writing that book and doing well from that movie, wrote a book called Worm, which was about a piece of computer code that went global. The code was called Conficker, right? But it was a worm. A worm is a particular type of piece of malware that self-replicates all over the place. And you got into questions very early about what kind of controls the authors of this kind of software were going to put in place. And if you think that's a new issue, Conficker was first spotted in 2008. And Mark Bowden's book came out in 11, I think. And so we have textual evidence and everything to draw on, again, not for one-to-one copy, but to use incidents like that to say, what were the international issues at play here? How did the international legal community respond or not respond? And so we should be drawing on those experiences, I think, to inform and get us accelerated past the 10, 15 years of learning and experimenting that's gone on in the cyber world. Hopefully we can get more clarity sooner in the age of AI. Just a note, on the 3 points about sovereignty, international norms, and offense, because, those are 3 areas where I would start. Nations disagree about the implications for sovereignty when one state launches a computer network operation against another state that goes through 15 other states. So why does the internet work the way it does? Because it's what's known as a packet-switched network. That means that when I write an email to my wife, replying, we're in the same house. I write an email and I reply saying, yes, I will take out the trash and the recycle before I go on a trip. That email doesn't go point to point because we might have crummy connections thanks to Verizon or Comcast or wherever you live, right? It's going to go through the best routing that the internet and other global routers say that's the most efficient path forward, agnostic of state boundaries. And so the very nature of connecting one's country to the internet, in some sense, shapes how you relate to and align with sovereignty, because you are opening yourself up to a global network of routers that are going to route traffic based on efficiency, not based on sovereignty, right? That's just inherent in the architecture of the internet. Of course, there are ways to control and shape that. Authoritarian countries around the world have done that, and we can talk about that in the Q&A if you want. Some of the ways, though, that states have sought to control and manage what they do online has been through an effort of developing international norms of conduct below the level of armed conflict. And this is key here. It's not trying to take on LOAC or change LOAC. There's a belief still in DOD, not that I'm speaking for DOD lawyers since I never was one, but they tell me the law of armed conflict applies in cyberspace just like it does in all the other space. Sea, in the air, on land, outer space. So below the level of armed conflict, though, is an area where states have had to manage what we're doing to each other in cyberspace. Peacetime norms was a way to try to do that through the auspices of a group of governmental experts at the UN. But looking at this in 2025, after 15 years of work, I got to tell you, it's hard to have a lot of faith. Right? It's one thing when ISIS is your problem, and Russia, China, and others are able to come together for straight-up conversations about these things. But today, that looks very, very difficult to think about getting the kind of consensus that we had 10 to 15 years ago. And bringing this forward to today even as an item or an issue that has been verboten for years to talk about licensing or otherwise granting a private company or a private entity legal cover to attack another nation. That's on the table today. That is an area of live discussion among entities. I don't know how broad. I'm not involved anymore. I'm defrocked. I'm a stay-at-home dad. But it's an area that I think for those who read lawfare and just security, you're gonna see this coming up, and all the issues that from sovereignty to insurance companies and how it changes how you think about insuring an attacker versus a victim. All that stuff is going to get thrown in the air, and how AI is going to affect that is something that I think really the cyber community needs to embrace the AI community to understand, because it's not just our grandmother's cyber operations anymore from 20 years ago. These now are being infused with the benefit and risks that AI models bring. Final point I would just make before we do some questions. There was a point about decision-making and how AI will affect decision-making. Let me just tell you, when when you go through the Senate confirmation process and you have to sit down with individual senators before your hearing, and they start to tell you that you are the throat to choke for cyber issues now, if you're confirmed, I take that pretty seriously as a responsibility. You think I'm going to let some ChatGPT analysis get me into trouble with the Senate or with the House, and I go up there and my answer is, well, OpenAI told me so, or Google told me so, right? Baloney. Decision makers still have to own their decisions. There is still accountability. Even today, there is still accountability. I felt it very strongly. And while I'm sure decision makers in the future will benefit from AI assists in a variety of contexts, there's still meetings that we got to go to. There's still discussions you got to have in person. And ultimately, someone who's going to have my job is going to have to make balls and strikes decisions about what we're going to authorize and what we're not going to authorize on policy grounds. And that's a human endeavor. And I, for the foreseeable future, don't see that changing. Thanks very much for having me.
Yeah, no, thank you. I have so many questions. I've written down so much. I want to stick, though, on the point you're making, Michael, about, just the changing nature of how these issues are evolving. And in particular, Lauren, I'll come back to you on international law, right, and the application now under this new AI space. Do we see, and I think Sherry also sort of suggests this as well, that we need to have another conversation in terms of what the elasticity of international looks like in this space where the technology is rapidly changing. I think Michael's suggesting where we're seeing less human interaction, where we need more, right, in terms of fully autonomously charged weapons. I'm just curious, how do we close that gap where the law itself may not necessarily be amenable to what we're seeing in terms of the pace of technology?
Well, I'll speak specifically to the law of armed conflict piece of it. The argument I was trying to make is that, we don't want to move away from those legal requirements. I think they're sufficient. The question then becomes, though, with these new technologies like AI, potentially like cyber, how do we make sure we're meeting those standards? And so it's a contentious issue because we've moved into the policy realm and we've come up with all of these different policy options. There was an executive order here in the U.S. in the early days rescinding the previous executive order on AI. There is a strategy due soon for the U.S. government. There's a DoD ethical principles of AI, which is actually, I think, quite good. But it doesn't say how much of that is dependent on law, how much of this is norms, how much of this is just additional policy, right? And when that happens, there's generally good ideas here, but you can sometimes then have people conflate what are their actual legal obligations and what is just policy that can be rolled back. I think we also have the political declaration, right, on responsible military use of AI and autonomy, which generally said good things, but when you read it, it's vague, right? Lots of references to appropriate steps, appropriately oversee, appropriate care, appropriate safeguards. And so there's still this huge open question on, okay, if we can agree on the legal standards though, but what does that mean in practice and how do we get there? And I think that's, really where we are. And there is a valid argument that sometimes if we move over to these policy and non-binding documents, that takes pressure away from potentially, additional law that may be clarifying or helpful. It also may confuse people who think that all of the obligations here are policy obligations and not truly legal ones, which I think we've all talked about today, that there are quite a few legal ones. So, a specific recommendation, the UN Secretary General asked for recommendations on what we should be doing on military use of AI. ICRC put out their recommendations last night. I would love to see more in that kind of world where we're coming up with specific recommendations. Okay, what does it mean for it to be auditable? What does that mean? In what recommendations, in what processes do you do that? And we're not there yet. We have people starting to go there, but there's a lot of work still to be done.
Mm-hmm. And I don't know if we get Sherry back on the screen. Can you hear me, Sherry, at least?
Yes, I can
okay,
hear
perfect.
You now.
So, yeah, and as long as you can hear, and then I want anybody to respond to this, but I want to make sure I get another question to each of you. You spoke a lot about, this mimicry and sort of I assume like the deep fakes of military technologies. I'd like to hear more and whether or not the existing international law and regulations and statutes are going to be enough to even address, I think what Lauren is suggesting, not just the technical operations of that, but also the policy implications if we see much more of that mimicry that actually results in more violence.
Yes, thank you. So I think this really complements or continues Lauren's points, because what I wanted to say here is that the problem is really not with the principles themselves, but really with the issue of compliance.
Mm-hmm.
And how do we, sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Um, so the problem is that compliance is always a challenge. And like Lauren said, the fog of war and uncertainty means that we have a variety of options, and as long as they're reasonable, that's acceptable. But as decision making becomes more complex, the role of the human in that human machine interaction becomes smaller or becomes intertwined with other machines and other humans. It becomes very difficult to evaluate the possibility of compliance, even so, even in theory. What does it mean when you're simply participating in a very minor way, not being aware of everything else, not being aware of the type of information, where it comes from, what the source is, what's there, how updated the source is, right? It becomes much more difficult to evaluate who is responsible. So I think if we go back to Lauren's example of the lawyer using ChatGPT, I think in warfare, especially in drone warfare, in intense operations, it's not the same, because you don't have the lawyer sitting in the office working hours on a brief and deciding to rely on ChatGPT, knowing the problems with ChatGPT. We are talking about many humans working in complex, decision making interactions with other humans and other machines, not being able to fully evaluate, both because of urgency, both because of their role, both because of the lack of transparency about most of these sources.
Thank you for that. And Michael, I want to bring you back in, because I think this lack of transparency, and I'm struck by the Chat GPT model, but I'll go a little deeper, right? So I had the opportunity to write for the Securities Commission a paper on AI in financial systems, so global financial systems. Don't ask me, folks, how I got appointed to write that paper, but I did. But one of the things I learned about was, if we're going into fully autonomous scenarios, then the nature of this conversation we're having about human oversight changes, right? Because if something is fully autonomous, you're really dealing with, and Dr. Michael Wellman at Michigan uses this term of these super manipulators that essentially can come in and take over. And where is the human oversight starts and stops is just unknown, because that's the goal of the AI, to have greater than human cognition. I'm just curious from you, from a cyber perspective, and since you put out there that example with regards to just where AI is, and obviously we know weaponization happens outside of military force, it also happens in these embedded institutional systems. Do we have the right framework for looking at this, just, not just policy, cyber? Should we be moving towards, I work a lot with Stephanie Pell and others, should we be moving towards something that's a little bit more connected and conjoined versus something that's looking at these as separate conversations?
I think it's a great point. And, I would just say practically from where I sat, I would ask about the international law implications of what I was being brought to get my sign-off on. But the reality is that by the time something gets to me, or got to me previously, it had been workshopped pretty aggressively with and among a bunch of lawyers and policy people already. So, people had the arguments down pretty crisp, by the time I was involved. And so the legal frameworks I felt were there, were respected. I was never part of a conversation where we had to say, oh man, but for international law, we could really protect the country. No, I mean, everybody knows that you're going to comply. We're going to play it by the book. And that also does not mean you're going to retreat. And there's not a suicide pact complying with international law. You do both. You comply with international law, you be straight up about that, and you impose cost on those who threaten the country and cross you. So, and not personally, obviously, but I mean, from a national interest standpoint. So, to me, I would say also, I think a lot of my colleagues, I don't want to speak for others, but I would have our lawyers from Cyber Command and OSD in the room with me. And so, to Sherry's point, I mean, maybe this is the cyber community, but it's such a small community. I know the lawyer at Cyber Command. I've known him for over 10 years. The lawyer, my top guy in OSD, I've known him for over a decade. It's very easy for me at that point as the policymaker to talk to my lawyers and say, hey, no kidding. Like, any problems here? Be straight. It's okay. If we need to redo something, it's okay. So it's a personal thing as well, which I would offer as a sign of encouragement in these communities, that if there's uncertainty, policymakers and their lawyers, they know each other decently well in this world.
And it also suggests to me that there's probably a lot more collaboration. I think probably the conversations that need to happen more, and it was mentioned earlier, is just more technical expertise and some level setting around just some common frameworks, right? Common definitions, common goals. I find with AI, I don't know about many people in this room, sometimes we're talking about the same thing, but we're really not talking about the same thing. And so doing some of that level setting would be helpful.
If I might, though, just to reassure, nothing's going to make it to the Secretary of, nothing's going to get until people are clear on what we mean by AI. So just to reassure, I mean, it's good for the academy to debate these things and really workshop through frameworks, but I don't want to leave people with the impression that, as these technologies come into government, we're just winging it, with our seniors and hoping that when I say AI, you know what I mean, right? I mean, it's
pretty clear,
pretty aggressively. And clearly before any big decision makers brought in.
That's right. Now, I had promised one of the attendees I was going to go to Q&A, and so I want to do that, and I just want to bring up, there were some other areas that I want to talk about. If we have time, we'll get to those, which is on bias, Sherry, that you mentioned. I'd love to hear a little bit more, and I think the audience would as well in terms of mitigation and identification of that. Please state your name and just provide us with a question.
Sure, thank you very much. My name is Erica George. I'm the Associate Dean for Equity, Justice, and Engagement at Boston University Law School. My general area of scholarship is business and human rights, so I was very appreciative and struck by the comment about private actors as proxies. And I wanted to invite each of the panelists to perhaps speak if you had maybe top three priorities of what we should be thinking about with private actors, business enterprises engaged in the development and deployment of AI, because if we look at the EU AI Act, national security and military uses are completely accepted from even being regulated. So if we're in a soft law space or a policy law space, or perhaps we're in the space of still thinking that customary international humanitarian law might be applicable, we're still dealing with the private actor. So if you had maybe 3 policy things that you would want to introduce or have students talking about in the class, how should we be thinking about strategies?
And I'll ask, are there other questions? Because if we go with 3, there's not going to be another question. So if it's okay with you, Erica, I'll ask each of the panelists to give me about 2, okay? And then we'll go to the next question. Response? Sherry, Lauren, Michael? Who would like to go first, just to answer that question? Give us a couple.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't know if I have a couple. Just from a LOAC perspective, the one thing that I think we haven't fully figured out when it comes to private actors is attribution and all the difficulties that come with attribution when it comes to AI or cyber or what it be, and how difficult attribution is, and then how difficult accountability becomes as a result of that.
I just note, and here I might take a different view when it comes to cyber operations, because now there are so many private entities and governments watching what goes on in cyberspace. It gets pretty easy to figure out who's doing what. The issue is that people don't want to say how they know who's doing what. But it's not that it's unclear who's doing what. So for me, the one issue I would flag for discussion with students and other entities is if we're in an era where regulation and law may not be your traditional vehicles of governance, insurance strikes me as that kind of next order backstop to organize how private entities behave. And if someone who would otherwise get an insurance policy now can't get an insurance policy because they're not complying with an insurer's policy preferences, that's one way to shape behavior.
Sherry?
And so I think perhaps the problem that I see in this area is the role of private companies in developing weapons and in the cyber arm race, especially around issues like development of drones and development of capacities and software to that are used for different types of surveillance. So I think in this space, there is lack of transparency, even though we know, and so perhaps I agree with Michael that we know who does what, but we don't really know. And a lot of this, is behind the stage, and there is a lack of transparency around funding and sources and payments, and as well as the intensity in which governments rely on some private companies in that sort of ecospace or ecosystem of warfare technologies.
Thank you for that. We'll go to the second question. Say your name and then state your question.
Okay, hi. My name is Susan Abwade, and I am a Georgetown law student, also. I hope you guys can hear me, but formerly part of the campaign to stop killer robots. Part of my question is sort of, recently the UN Secretary General, and also we saw in the UN General Assembly, there was an overwhelming vote for resolution on treaty negotiations on lethal autonomous weapon systems. And I'm sort of wondering, to Lauren's point, how you would sort of contend or square this idea that the global majority is seeing that the LOAC or the laws of IHL or armed conflict are sort of like operating as the floor of the protections that we need against these killer robots or against these primarily autonomous weapons that are operating within this space. And also, like, within those recommendations that you mentioned, I'm sort of wondering where accountability would fall in, right? So, like, how do we hold human operators criminally accountable under international law without having this sort of, more protective treaty that states are working towards? And anyone can answer this question, and I'd be curious, Sherry, for sort of your perspectives on this too, like thinking about this this pushback against the neutrality of algorithms. Thank you.
Perfect. Lauren, you want to go first, and then Sherry in terms of?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I would say that like there's no space for there to be additional law when it comes to AI and emerging technologies. I am very strongly of the belief that like the principles of LOAC also apply to AI, and the same types of ensuring that we have, distinction, proportionality, that we're making reasonable decisions. All of that is still valid. And I think that sometimes we confuse people not following those principles and then not being held accountable with there not being enough law on the topic. And so I would just want to make sure that we pull those two things apart. I mean, one concept for accountability that's in IHL and it's in ICL as well is that of command responsibility, right? And the idea that a commander is responsible for the actions of the subordinates, and in their war crimes, whether or not they knew, but they should have known, right? And in an AI world, you can say, if the commander decided to use this AI and it was a black box and they didn't know how it was making decisions, right? Like that is a violation of IHL. In those cases where it goes on to commit war crimes and they say, oh, I didn't really understand how it worked and I didn't bother to learn, right? And I think you can use those principles. It's just that the examples are novel.
Sherry, you want to respond? And hopefully,
yes,
young man,
you.
we'll get to your last question, okay?
I'll be brief. I just wanted to say that we haven't really had time to discuss the questions around human oversight or verification as opposed to the other option, which is, fully autonomous weapons that, so there is a scale and there are problems in every step of this scale, right? So there are some moral accountability issues and, other types of error-based issues with fully autonomous systems. But there are other types of problems with every different type of human oversight or human verification based on different types of human-machine interactions. And so I think, from my perspective, none of the options is, free from bias or free from error. Even if we have just a human, if we have a human-machine interaction in very different ways, or if we have a fully autonomous system, each of those options have a lot of different problems. And I think our challenge today is really identifying what are the main weaknesses in each step on this big spectrum, and then trying to mitigate. We cannot ever resolve or solve this, but we can try to mitigate by identifying the main challenges and then finding some solutions to mitigate those issues.
Thank you. Okay, now you heard the other room just clapped, right? Why don't you share your question, and then I'm sure the panelists will be around to be able to answer those. So at least for the purpose of our audience to hear what you were going to ask.
Absolutely. Good afternoon. Thank you so very much for the wonderful perspectives. I'm Miran Sergeyev, a scholar with Temple Law, and I also work as a research assistant with the Institute for Law, Innovation, and Technology. My question is specific to the arms race we're currently seeing in the competition between military-industrial complexes. The notion of fully autonomous weapon systems enabled by artificial intelligence, making decisions by themselves on the field to kill humans, potentially resulting in civilian casualties. We've discussed international law in terms of criminal, in terms of law of armed conflict. I wonder, when it comes to the policy side of things, what can be done to constrain this kind of competition, and how can lawyers best advise defense firms so that we don't end up in a horrible exchange with these kinds of weapon systems?
So I'm going to do something, and Michael, I'm going to give you the last word, and I'll give you 20 seconds of advice.
Okay. There's lots of space for that we can talk about after the panel. How's that? Just to make sure you can, this is how I recognize the Friday afternoon before the happy hour.
I mean, what I would just suggest is the reason that we have this panel is because this is a dialogue that we need to have more conversation on. And it needs to be in conversations outside of just military operations, but among people who are multi-stakeholders and have some vested interest in this process and in this conversation. So I would suggest reach out to these panelists, but more importantly for everybody here, I mean, the train has left the station, and I think the more and more we see autonomously driven weaponry, it's actually gonna be a conversation we're gonna continue to have, and we didn't get squarely into the ethics and the responsibility of what that looks like going forward, so.
Join ASIL's Liber Society.
That's it, okay, thank you. And on that note, let's give a round of applause to all of our panelists. Thank you, everybody. Sherry, get some rest.